Well, welcome everybody. I'd like to call this meeting to order. And the first item is the proposed, if you look in your agenda book, it's I-1, proposed revisions to 19 TAC, Chapter 113, Text Essential Knowledge and Skills for Social Studies, and proposed repeal of 19 TAC, Chapter 118, Text Essential Knowledge and Skills for Economics, with emphasis on the free enterprise system and its benefits. And of course, this is second reading and final adoption. And before we start, I just want to let folks know that the live streaming is down in the entire building, just so you know. But they are recording, and then we'll post as soon as the feed is up. So just to let you know, we're going to go ahead and continue with our plan for the hearing. But before we start, I want to talk about the way we do our public testimony. And in order to hear as many people as possible, a testimony will be limited to 2 minutes per speaker today. And if a previous speaker has made many of your points, we strongly encourage testifiers to say that you agree with the speaker and then the previous speaker, and focus your testimony on any new points that you'd like to add to the discussion. That 2 minutes does pass pretty quickly. And then we'll have opportunity for members to ask questions. And of course, members, this is our opportunity to hear from the public and not a time to debate the speakers or with each other, because we'll have that opportunity to talk amongst ourselves at the end of the hearing today. If a speaker has people in support of his or her position today, please don't stand behind the podium where the speakers are speaking, as it just makes it too difficult to figure out who the next speaker is going to be. But of course, you're welcome to acknowledge them in your 2 minutes and welcome your supporters, have them wave their hands or whatever. If you have any handouts, please give them to staff. And we've got Ms. Sanchez over here in the corner who's ready to receive any handouts that you have, and then they will hand them out so they can be distributed to all the members. If you will, speakers, all you testifiers, there are sheets with the name of testifiers out there on the table. Please keep an eye, grab one of those, keep an eye on the list so that you'll know when your time is going to be up. And what will happen if you're not in the room when we call, we're just going to keep on moving, and you'll be welcome to speak at the very end if you're not here for your slot. But we're going to keep moving through the testimony slots. All right, I think we're ready to begin our public hearing. We will have 2 minutes. You will hear a bell at 30 seconds before the end of your 2 minutes. And that means that you've got 30 seconds to go, and so kind of start making sure you get to your major points if you haven't gotten to those yet. And then you'll hear two bells, and that means your time is out. So if you will wrap up your speaking at that point with your final point, and then, as we said, you'll have an opportunity to answer any questions of our members here after we've heard from 4 testifiers.
I'm Dr. Sandra Alfonsi, and I'm here, first of all, to thank the Texas State Board of Education for all that it's done and for allowing me to be here from Jerusalem, Israel, to respond in favor of something that you have put in your guidelines. I'm responding in support, historically, of your statement that Arab rejection of the State of Israel has led to the ongoing conflict. Arab rejection of a state for the Jewish people has, in fact, determined that Palestinian Arabs do not have a state of their own. It is the intransigence of the Arab world that created the conflict, maintains it, and exacerbates it. The Arab world rejected the British Peel Commission two-state solution in 1937. The Arab world rejected the UN partition plan in 1947. On February 15, 1947, Great Britain turned the issue of the Palestine Mandate over to the United Nations and created the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine to investigate the issue and suggest appropriate measures to be taken. It proposed a plan that called for the partition of the British Mandate of Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state. The Arab inhabitants of Palestine would have had their own state then, with a larger landmass than the Jewish state. When Israel declared its independence in May 1948, it was within the borders drawn by the United Nations. The Arab leadership in Palestine and the League of Arab States unconditionally rejected the UN partition plan on the grounds that all of Palestine should become a Palestinian state, and it thereby created the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was founded by the Arab League of Nations in 1964. The Arabs rejected Israel's peace negotiations at the Khartoum Conference in 1967. The Arab nations rejected the 1978 Camp David peace accords by ejecting Egypt from the Arab League. Failure of the Oslo Peace Accords. In 1993, Israeli Prime Minister Rabin and PLO leader Arafat reached the agreement. The PLO recognized Israel's right to exist, and Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinians. The recognition by the PLO of Israel's right to exist was only verbal, and it was a recognition of Article 15, which never changed. Therefore, in 2018, today, the Arab world continues to demonize Israel, slander America, reject Israel's peace efforts. The PLO, the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, Fatah, and Hezbollah are actively attacking at this moment Israel from Gaza, which is controlled by the Hamas. Thank you.
I think, Madam Chair, we had the follower, the person that came the furthest today from Jerusalem. Is that Jerusalem, East Texas, or is that?
They're sister cities.
Sister city, okay. Because there's also a Paris, Texas, whatever, but okay.
Yes, well.
Thank you so much for being here today. This is the amendment I put in. We put it in 10 years ago. It was stricken. I put it back in again last time. And I call it the Nikki Haley Amendment, which she said, how do you negotiate when other countries refuse to even recognize you exist? Are there nations right now, member states of the UN, who refuse to recognize that Israel exists?
There are member states that refuse to acknowledge its existence. They have strict laws regarding that the Israelis cannot go into their countries. If you look at what is going on right now, you can look at Saudi Arabia, you can look at Yemen, you can look at Libya, you can look at many of the Muslim countries, and they do not recognize the right of Israel to exist. But paramount to what you've put in, and why I'm really responding in support of the concept of Arab rejection of the state of Israel, it really has to be understood, and I'm so proud of Texas for all the work I've done with Truth in Texas textbooks and now Truth in textbooks, that Texas is the only state which does recognize the problems that are over there, and that when you say Arab rejection of the state of Israel, I look at the partition plan, and I look at the evil intention of the Arab League and the Arab nations, which took away the possibility of Palestinian Arabs and Palestinian Jews, because that is what the partition was supposed to be. A state for the Palestinian Jews, a Jewish state, and a state for the Arabs. The word Palestinian didn't come into use as a political weapon until after the Six-Day War. But from 1947, the Arab League and the Arab nations have prevented masses, millions of people from having a homeland. And if you look at the history, and I realize I read over time, but every moment that Israel has tried valiantly to return land in first of all for borders, for peace. But if you look at the fact that the PLO was founded and its charter in Article number 15 calls for the destruction of the state of Israel, and yet that is a sign, that was part of the Oslo Accords, that was part of many of the agreements, and yet that article has never been changed and has never been removed. Therefore, they are not a viable peace partner. The Fatah has a charter, and the charter has an Article 22, which calls for the destruction of Israel, but is even worse when you stop to think that they blame the Israelis as an evil force on all of humanity. And therefore, when you designate the Israelis, and we have to be very clear about this, that anti-Israel and anti-Semitism are the same thing. You want to destroy the Jewish state, you want to destroy the Jewish people, and you have non-viable peace partners. So therefore, I love the Arab rejection of the state of Israel. Yes, from 1947 on, it has been the Arab rejection by the Arab League that spoke for the indigenous Arab population. You have an indigenous Jewish, you have an indigenous Arab population, and you have an Arab League and Arab nations that have really, in their own way, sacrificed the lives of all of those Arabs, of all of the, now that we call them the Palestinians. But right now, in 2018, right now, yesterday, there were 250 to 400 between the number of rockets falling, shot on southern Israel. This time they're not burning the ground. This time they're not burning forests. This time they went after and targeted the civilians. And that's Fatah with its charter and its Article 22. That's the PLO with its Article 15. That's Abbas. That is the Arab League. You go nation after nation that are calling and supporting, and then wait for Iran to come in, and the Hezbollah. That is why I think the wording of this is exactly historically correct. It does not excuse mistakes made by the State of Israel, but it certainly puts the onus for the problems of the Middle East and this ongoing conflict. It's not Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is an Arab-Israeli conflict. And that is what I think, that is why this terminology is historically viable, and it's also the truth. And if we look at the civilization around us, we have a deficit in historical truth. We don't know what's fake, we don't know what's real, and I applaud, and I'm saying it all honestly, when Roy White said to me, you have to come to Texas, I came straight to Texas because I was told, just like Israel is the one-star state, Texas is the one-star state, and you are the last state standing in this country that's helping to fight anti-Semitism. And for that, I give you all my love and admiration.
So you would agree then with Ambassador Nikki Haley, and that's what I call my amendment.
Yes.
I called the Nikki Haley, she said, how do you negotiate, which she mentioned two clauses. She said once, when you have, and by the way, Ms. Sanchez, if you can pass it out, I have a list of 36 members of the United Nations who refused to even recognize that Israel exists. And she said, how do we negotiate when, number one, we have certain countries will not even recognize our right to exist, and we have others who talk, as you mentioned, their goal is to exterminate Israel as a country, as a people.
Correct.
Would you agree with that? Is she correct what she's saying?
I agree wholeheartedly with that. I think that she is a miracle voice at the United Nations. But I do this for truth in education in the United States. I do this for the generations of Americans that are coming out of our school system. I'm very happy that she did this at the United Nations, but I am really indebted to Texas for allowing, I'm not a Texan, I want to be an honorary Texan, but I come from a non-state. I was born in Washington, D.C. That's a heritage that nobody talks about. And I have to say that here, in front of all of you, and I mean this seriously, there is no greater advocate right now for truth in education. No matter how many times something comes in, something goes out, there is a flame that's looking for truth. And as far as I am concerned as a Jew and an American citizen and now an Israeli citizen, there's no way for me to make you understand the love that's in my heart, because you're protecting two of me, the Jew, the American, and the Jew, the Israeli. And those are my two countries, and this is my state.
Two last questions. Were you aware that Saudi Arabia was chastised this week because they agreed to meet members of Israel?
Yes.
And they were chastised because if you meet with them, you're recognizing their right to exist.
Correct.
And you're aware that before what happened yesterday, you mentioned the 300 missiles that came across, shot at Israel. It was announced on Saturday that Hamas had already had 100,000 missiles and mortars pointed at Israel.
Yes,
and the goal to negotiate peace, correct?
The goal is to
exterminate.
And there isn't any way to look at anything other than the fact that yesterday, with all of those rockets and missiles really wreaking havoc on the population. Israel reopened the borders into Gaza so that they could bring the medical and the food supplies. Now, Israel is doing its retaliation is not retaliation. It is targeting structures. It targeted the television station building where a lot of what is going on comes out of, but it warned the civilian population in Gaza that the IDF Air Force was coming over. No one has warned anyone. No one stopped to warn, whether it's Sderot, whether it's in Ashkelon. Ashkelon, they went after apartment buildings. They found children, a baby buried under. It's now no longer, let's see how many trees we can burn with the condom-filled, excuse us, the balloons that are really the condoms that they're raining down, and they're burning acres of land, and they're killing off the livestock. They're destroying the fields. They're destroying everything. That's over because they did thousands and thousands of acres. Now they're going after the population, and they're going to see how far before Israel has a morality and an ethics that I find extraordinary, because any other nation, God forbid someone would try to attack the United States, we're not going to sit there and go, let's just do, restraint and that. And right now, after what happened, and it started again this morning, the rockets are going and the missiles are going again in that area. So
how many miles long or wide is Israel? 100 miles?
It's about the size of New Jersey.
yeah, it's about the size of New Jersey, if that's relative to Texas.
So it'd be like Austin firing 300 missiles towards
Yes.
South San Antonio.
Correct. You
Thank
can't miss.
Thank you.
There, okay. You can go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for hearing my testimony today and for caring for our children. Your decisions affect the future of our great state and the world. In defining the Texas curriculum, you define how much students are taught to think versus believe. Your curriculum also teaches students how to look at other people. With the recent Pittsburgh killings in a synagogue and the racist killings in Kentucky, maybe it's time to also teach our children how to treat our fellow human beings. Hatred is not a family value. It's not a Christian, Jewish, or Muslim value. Texas would be best served if our curriculum did not disparage any ethnic or religious group. All ethnic and religious groups have their heroes and villains, so to broadly condemn a whole group is racist or xenophobic. Consciously teaching against hatred is important because we have created a society that has rationalized the judgment, discrimination, and even killing of children, whether it be in Yemen, in Gaza, or even here in Texas at Santa Fe High School. It is Texans who killed churchgoers at Sutherland Springs and burned the mosque in Victoria last year. Our curriculum affects people's perceptions of others. In the World History Studies, it asks students to explain how Arab rejection of the State of Israel has led to ongoing conflict. This is factually incorrect because Palestinians are the Arabs in the ongoing conflict, and they've recognized Israel in the Oslo Accords, as was stated earlier. Meanwhile, Israel and the United States are part of a small minority of countries in the world that still reject recognition of Palestine. The 50-plus year occupation is proof of Israel's rejection of Arabs rather than Arab rejection of Israel. It is Israel's rejection of Palestinians' rights of return, citizenship, equality, freedom, and self-determination that caused the ongoing conflict. 70% of Gazans are refugees, yet Israel rejects their right of return to their homeland, only for the racist reasons that they are not Jewish. Please do not make our children political pawns by feeding them propaganda. It will only hurt the children and ultimately us as a society. I would ask that you would either remove that line from the curriculum or ask them to explain the Israel-Palestine conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. McDonald, some questions for you. Thank you for your testimony, and thank you for providing a different perspective on this particular standard. I noticed that you had a letter from Georgetown University that I'm not sure that you had time to talk about in your testimony. I was wondering if you could walk us through some of the recommendations that you're making
Sure. So I just mentioned, with the 2 minutes, I only mentioned one of 3 items that concerned us. We're concerned, and I involved educators as part of the coalition, and so Georgetown University is one of them. And part of the concern is, obviously, we want to teach our children how to think, not just one side of a particular story. And so those recommendations are based on that. I don't know, did I answer your question?
Yes, I think that it would be helpful for you to actually walk through the standards, in addition to the one, I think you focused most on 13F.
Yes.
But you're also pointing to a few others that I think are really good recommendations,
Okay.
you know, that kind of speak to your point about making sure that we are more aware about biases that we may be presenting in our standards.
Is there a way I can have one of my copies back? Would that be all right? Sorry, thank you. I apologize. So on the other one, next one was 14A, and which summarizes the development and impact of radical Islamic fundamentalism in the events of the second half of the 20th century. I'll basically summarize that part of the issue is it's important. All religions have had good and bad histories, and to label a particular kind of terrorism based on one particular religion ignores the fact that there's a lot of state terrorism. An occupation is a form of state terrorism. The blockade that's going on is a form of state terrorism. And for students to only hear about terrorism in the context of one particular religion really creates a bias. And that's why in my statement I was talking about it's really incumbent, I think, on us as Texans to really educate our children to be thinking critically and to have a better understanding of the world, but in how we look at each other as human beings. And I appreciate the earlier comment about Quakers, because I'm actually a Quaker, and one of our values in Testimonies is equality. And that's why I care so passionately about the Israel-Palestine situation, because it's a system of inequality, and it's one that we as Americans are actually funding. It's my weapons, my money, and my political capital in the United Nations that is contributing to this problem. So in 14A, the proposal our suggestion is to instead summarize the development and impact of political parties in the Middle East, as well as the rise of political and religious extremism in the second half of the 20th century. And then the last one is 24D, which currently is proposed as explain how developments in Islam influence law and government in the Muslim world, such as secularism, nationalism, and fundamentalism. And the suggestion there is to explain how developments in religions influence law and government in modern states and vice versa. Because the implication of 24 is that only religions influence governments, not vice versa, when in fact situations on the ground really cause extremism. And I think that's very important for students to understand. Did that help? Yes. Thank you.
One more follow-up question. So the recommendations are slightly different, like
Yes.
this list is slightly different from the Georgetown ones. Did you guys work together? Are you guys aligned in terms of recommendations you would make?
Well, it's a coalition, and as you all probably, as I can tell from votes that you've had, we're not always in full alignment, but I think that there's a common thread. And the common thread, again, is that we provide, I think any of the coalition members would be satisfied with some of the answers. So, for example, I would be perfectly satisfied with removing the 13F as we described, or I would even prefer that the students learn about the conflict in Israel-Palestine. But again, streamlining is your objective, and so I would want to honor that as well.
One more question for you. Can you tell us about the members of your coalition?
Sure. I apologize. It's on our website, txchr.org, and we have a variety of, we have Christian, Muslim, and Jewish groups. And then we also have Palestinian solidarity groups as well, but of all faiths. And I'm Quaker, so there you go. There's another one too. So, okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. To the same speaker, were you aware that as the review groups originally proposed these recommendations to us with regard to 13F and 13E, what they suggested was that we insert, with regard to 13E, the words including the Arab-Israeli conflict, which I think is very similar to what your Georgetown letter says, and then delete F, explain how the Arab rejection of the state of Israel led to ongoing conflict. So what the Georgetown group is, were you aware of the fact that what the Georgetown group and what you're advocating here was what the teachers' review groups recommended?
I was aware that that the committee had recommended striking F. I did not know that they had recommended adding E or changing that.
They did. Just to clarify for the record, they recommended in adding E, reasons for ongoing conflicts in the summary of the rise of independent movements in the Middle East,
Yes.
i.e. Israel's attempt for statehood or recognition of statehood. We insert including the Arab-Israeli conflict. Okay, and let me ask, so would that then remove the bias and the concerns that you have with regard to at least 13E and F if we followed the recommendations of the teacher review groups?
I think it's best to keep it generic so that everybody is on the same page and not give any particular side a preferential treatment.
Okay, and just also so you know, I don't know if the text of your testimony recognizes this, but Palestinian terrorism has been stricken.
I saw that, thank you.
Yeah, it's just,
and that's why I put a comment not for and against. That's a step in the right direction, I believe.
okay.
Because again, that's narrowing one particular type of terrorism, but again, I still think it's
Yeah, I understand your issues with Islamic
but thank you.
fundamentalism.
Thank you for that
Thank you,
direction.
sir. Appreciate your testimony.
Thank you all.
My name is Snehal Shingavi. I'm a professor at the University of Texas. I have been teaching there for the last 9 years and care very deeply about educating people from Texas. I grew up in Houston, went to college in San Antonio, and now have the privilege of teaching at the flagship university here in Texas. I'm speaking in direct response to section 113.42, subsection C, point 13.F. The clause is explain how Arab rejection of the state of Israel has led to ongoing conflict. The problem here is not only that the statement is not held up by the overwhelming consensus of historians in the Middle East, it's also an explicitly ideological claim that is being presented as if it is fact. I really want to make 5 points. I'll summarize them here because I won't get to them in all likelihood in the 2 minutes that I have. The first and most important one is that the claim is not held up by historians. If you look at the Middle Eastern Studies Association, if you look at the majority of peer-reviewed books and journal articles on the question of Israel and Palestine, you will see that it is not Arab rejection that is the cause of the conflict, but in fact, it's understood to be a multi-causal phenomenon, most overwhelmingly rooted in the expulsion of Palestinians from their homelands in the period between 1947 and 1948. Number 2, the claim is ideologically biased. Number 3, the claim is also patently untrue. A number of Arab states and Arab organizations have already recognized Israel. Number 4, there have never been negotiations that allowed for, wow, that was fast, that allowed for Palestinians the right to return to their homes. And number 5, there is no monolithic Arab identity. May 15th, the day after Israeli Independence Day, is the day that Palestinians commemorate the Nakba, or the catastrophe. It's a day that Palestinians remember the 750,000 civilians forcibly displaced from their homes and the more than 4 million acres of Palestinian land confiscated and occupied by the fledgling Israeli state. The Zionist slogan prior to the founding of Israel had been a land without a people for a people without a land, but in truth, Palestine had to be made into a land without a people. So between March 31st and May 15th, Zionist militias destroyed more than 200 Palestinian villages, perpetrated more than 24 massacres, and used terror to expel hundreds of thousands more Palestinians. Thank you.
So if we can, let's keep 2 people up at the mics at all times. That way the next person can just start.
Hannah Masri, followed by Geneva Might.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning.
Go ahead and turn that mic on. Okay, start over. There you go.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning. My name is Hannah Masri. I am an instructor in the Department of Communication right here at UT, and I wanted to register my objection to the proposed revisions to Chapter 113, Subchapter C, Sections 13F and 14A. As a scholar and researcher of communication and rhetoric, I am well acquainted with the way that the framing of a particular issue can lead to student bias and misunderstanding, and I believe that the proposed changes will do just that. Proposed revision 13F, for example, not only oversimplifies complex historical and political events, as we have heard, it also is fundamentally inaccurate. As others have noted, the Palestinian National Council recognized Israel's right to exist in 1988 and again in 1993 as a result of the Oslo Accords. There has been no reciprocal recognition of Palestine on the part of the Israeli state as a whole, and so ongoing conflict in the region therefore cannot be attributed to Arab rejection of the state of Israel. While the time does not allow me to discuss it fully in my statement here, I also welcome questions about Gaza and the distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which are concerns that have come up in earlier testimonies. My difficulty to capture all facets of this concern in my brief statement, I think, indicates the problems with trying to cover it in this one sentence in the textbook. Proposed revision 14A, meanwhile, is phrased in such a way that it tacitly implies only Muslims participate in terrorism. From there, it would not be difficult for students to infer that all Muslims are terrorists. Having such an idea tacitly affirmed in their assigned materials is not only misleading, it also creates an incredibly hostile environment for Muslim students. As Ms. Perez-Diaz mentioned, you have done a lot of work to think about inclusion in your creation and editing of these materials, and as someone from a Muslim and Middle Eastern family, I know that statements like that would make me not feel included in my classroom. Students regularly arrive to my classroom at UT under or misinformed on issues of history and politics, so I appreciate all of the work that this board is doing and has done to combat that. I know that you want better for them and for all students in Texas. I certainly do. And as a proud new Texan, so I'm originally from New Jersey, but I much prefer Texas and consider myself lucky to be here, I believe that we can do better for all of our young people, and I believe that rejecting these changes is an important step in that direction. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shifa Badi. I'm a middle school teacher. The proposal that the handout that you have in front of you, that's from me and also from my husband. He's a world history teacher with 7 years of experience. I teach middle school because when I was in 8th grade on 9/11/2001, that was the day that I received my first death threat in my locker. It was shoved in there. My teachers did nothing. A few years ago, a man told me that my kids deserved to have their heads cut off. The day of my father's funeral, my sister and I, we were driving to the mosque for his service, and we were nearly run off the road. When I looked at these standards, the ones that I have in front of you with proposals, what I saw is an opportunity to combat the type of bias that I have faced in my life, and the type of bias that I'm afraid that my 6-year-old daughter will one day face in her life and that my 4-year-old son will face in his life. It's the type of bias that my 8th grade Muslim students sometimes experience as well. Specifically, we have a lot of anti-Muslim bias that we hear from people in positions of power, that we hear in media. We've heard some in the room today. And I think that removing certain things, I want to focus specifically on 1C, removing the development of the Islamic Caliphate from the standard, I think that's detrimental, because what it does is it ignores the contributions, the positive that's come out of Islam and Islamic civilization in the world. I think that's incredibly important in order to combat some of the bias that we see in the world today. So when I was a student, I didn't have anybody to advocate for me. That's why I'm here right now. I'm hoping that I can advocate for my students and for my own children so that they grow up in a world where there's a more well-rounded and unbiased view about about their beliefs. I would really appreciate your feedback on that. Thank you.
So for the 4 speakers that are up at a time, just kind of stay in this designated area, these designated seats, and then you'll speak and let members ask questions at the end of the 4. Okay, members, anybody have questions of this particular set of 4? Okay, I don't hear any, but I got to say this is my favorite that I've ever received.
Thank you.
In all of the history of the SBOE that I've been on. I really like colors. And I like the way that this is just super clear in a way that, you can say, okay, here's what it says, here's what I suggest, here's why I suggest it, in a very easy to follow format. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the feedback.
Absolutely. Yes, Ms. Beltran.
Thank you so much for your testimony.
Absolutely.
Ms. Bhatti. Can you talk a little bit more about your specific suggestion on 14A? So you just basically explained the rationale to us around your request to remove fundamentalism.
Sure. The fundamentals of any religion are the core of its religion. To tie Islam and terrorism and fundamentalism all together is to say that terrorism is a fundamental part of Islam, which it absolutely is not. I think it's incredibly biased, and I think all it does is to serve to impress that bias upon our students.
You also explained the rationale around the second recommendation to include, you're basically suggesting that we include its impact on the Middle East.
Yes. We study world history to understand the world around us, to see why we got here. And I know that it seems like quite a bit of an ask to add that in, because it's a lot of information. However, the Middle East is a bit of a mess right now. I think we can all agree on that. And there are several contributing factors. And one of those contributing factors is the U.S. response in the Middle East after 9/11. Invading Iraq created a power vacuum, and then the dominoes just started to fall and things started to destabilize. I think if we simply address how the U.S. responded to September 11th without seeing the aftermath, then it leaves this huge gap in the knowledge for kids where they can't figure out, but how do we get to where we are now? And the only way then to fill the gap is to listen to the propaganda of that Islam is incompatible with the West, which is what we've heard literally come out of people's mouths, that Muslims shouldn't be in the U.S., that we're not trustworthy, so on and so forth. And so unless we specifically address the why, which is geopolitical factors, it's not religion, I think it's detrimental to our students. I think we're doing them a disservice, because if we want them to go on to the world and solve the problems that we have, then they need to actually understand cause and effect relationships and not just propaganda.
Mr. Bradley.
Yeah, I would like to echo the chair's compliment of your presentation and the fact that, yes, you identified, you gave us an overview, you identified a problem, but more than anything, you came up with a recommendation to fix it. So many people just want to get up and complain. And it's always nice to bring a solution to the table to be considered. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, and I would like to follow up with regard to 14B. And this is just maybe a little more of a detailed question. But under the current expectation, it said, explain the U.S. response to terrorism from September 11, 2001 to the present. Mm-hmm. And then you would like to add, and its impact on the Middle East.
Yes.
As a middle school teacher, and I'm really not intending to argue your language or the thought behind it, but just as a practical matter, would you not be able to cover the impact on the Middle East in your lesson plans and in your curriculum if we left that 14B as is? And a follow-up question to that is, understanding that the assessments, the tests are going to be driven by what these expectations say, and I would have a little bit of a concern that if we add and its impact on the Middle East, we don't have an assessment for that already. I don't know whether it's covered in the textbooks or not, but so there isn't an assessment for it, and you're really kind of opening up a whole new realm of testing that otherwise a teacher could cover in the classroom as originally proposed, but then, and it wouldn't necessarily be tested on, it would just be the impact on terror or its response to terrorism. Would you address that?
I absolutely 100% understand your concern because I had the same concern as I was typing. So I would say that it is possible for a teacher to cover the impact as well as the U.S. response, but I think it's important to specify because there are ways to talk about what has the U.S. done without talking about what was a result of U.S. interaction and in the Middle East, exactly. So I think it is important to specify because otherwise it is incredibly easy to leave out. And I think one of the reasons that I believe that is because when we hear people in positions of power talking about the Middle East, we hear a lot of lack of accountability of where these problems arose from. So I think talking about specifically the impact on the Middle East is important to have like a well-rounded view of what the situation actually came from. As far as the testing goes, I definitely, like I said, I completely understand the concern. As a Muslim woman who's daily impacted by these types of biases, I would tell you that my personal opinion on this is that if it's a little extra to teach, but the trade-off is knowledge, I'm for it. So, thank you.
I was just going to say, I think the main issue with that particular one is it would be new content. And in streamlining, we cannot do that. But when this comes back, in a few years for the full revision, then things like this can be considered because this, would potentially not be covered in the book. So that would be problematic, in my opinion. Yeah. Thank you, though.
Thank you.
And I'm so sorry about what happened to you and your sister and in your locker, and things like that just break my heart. But look at where you are now. You're here.
Yeah.
You're speaking to us. You're strong.
Right.
And you're a teacher.
Yes, and I'm not. I didn't want to say any of that for pity. I don't. I think those things brought me the strength that I have. I just don't want my kids to have the same experiences. All right. Thank you.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Should have two people at the mic at each time. Pardon me?
My handouts?
Yeah, give those to our, yeah. There you go. Right here in the corner is great. So if we could just have two at a time, and then, did you read the rest of the list there for 4? Or, let's see, where are we? Oh, 2 at a time, sorry.
Okay.
Yes,
morning.
go ahead.
My name is Haytham El Zabri. I'm a Palestinian American and now a proud Texan also. I would like to comment on line 13F, which requires students to explain how Arab rejection of the State of Israel has led to ongoing conflict. This requirement asks students to explain something that is factually not correct. As a Palestinian, I'm deeply troubled because this negates my history and my rights. What has led to ongoing conflict is Israel's rejection of Palestinian human and national rights, including the right to self-determination, freedom, and equal rights, and including personally my right to return to my parents' homeland. As an American, I'm very concerned about our children being taught only one side of the story. And I'll share a personal experience about this. As a student, many years ago, I used to screen Palestinian documentary films at the law school, and the most common reaction that I was getting was one of shock and anger. Law students told me that they had no idea about this and wondered why. I think 13F is a disservice to our future leaders, and I hope the board would reconsider and accept the original recommendation from the committee to strike out that line. Thank you.
Charles Kaufman, followed by Roy White.
Madam Chair, committee members, good morning. My name is Charles Kaufman. I'm the president of B'nai B'rith International, and I'm speaking on behalf of the organized Jewish communities in Austin, Greater Houston, San Antonio, Greater Dallas, Fort Worth, and Tarrant County, represented by Jewish Federations of Texas. We appreciate the goal of streamlining the TEAC's social studies standards and the hard and careful work of all the work groups. We appreciate the inclusion of the coverage of Judaism, the Holocaust, and ancient Israel in the proposed final draft of the TEAC's standards. We are here today to testify to specifically ensure that coverage of modern Israel, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the proxy war between the United States and Soviets in the Middle East is retained in Standard 13F. These are essential topics that every public school student should learn. The proposed final version of World History TEACs deletes Workgroup E's original language about Arab-Israeli conflict in Standard 13E, and 13F is the only place that allows this important history to be covered. The current version focuses on the origins of the Arab-Israeli conflict in a standard that covers Cold War history, so it's relevant and historically accurate. In 1947, the United Nations voted to partition the Palestine Mandate into two states, Arab and Jewish, with Jerusalem as an international city. The Arabs immediately rejected the partition plan. Jews accepted it and established Israel legally on the territory that contained a Jewish majority, as approved by the United Nations General Assembly. These are historical facts. Immediately after Israel declared statehood on May 14, 1948, 5 armies invaded from Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq. These too are historical facts. The invasion failed, but Jordan annexed the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Egypt took over Gaza. 2 wars followed in 1967 and 73, and in which Arab states rejected the right of Israel to exist. This rejection is historical fact. You know the rest, leaping forward about 40 years with the Oslo Accords, failed negotiations, broken agreements, admissions that were not lived up to. These are all part of history. We live in a time of revisionism, and this is a very important point. When people seek to revise or deny history as a way of placating parties involved, history cannot afford to lose sight of the facts to somehow level the playing field. That's not history. That's not even education. So it is important for public school students to learn about this origin and history of this topic so they can better understand the present-day implications of the Israel-Arab conflict for all parties involved. We urge the board to retain Standard 13F. This sentence is not the only place that requires this important history to be covered. The current proposed version of Standard 13F accurately addresses the origins of the conflict and continued rejection of Israel by Arab states. Again, we urge the board to retain 13F. Thank you again for the opportunity to share the concerns from Jewish communities of Texas, and we appreciate the continued opportunities for oral and written feedback. Thank you.
Roy White, followed by Jan Barstow.
Hi, my name is Roy White. I'm the president and founder of Hi, my name is Roy White. I'm the founder and president of Truth in Textbooks, who've been appearing here since 2013. I'm also addressing 13F. Currently, 19 of the 21 countries that make up the Arab League do not recognize the State of Israel. Fact. 16 of these Arab countries do not admit persons with Israeli passports into their country. Fact. On November 26, 2014, Palestinian Authority Mahmoud Abbas in South Africa was quoted as saying the following: "We will never recognize the Jewishness of the State of Israel." Does this sound like a leader that has or will recognize Israel's right to exist? President Clinton was quoted after the failed talks with Arafat in 2000. The true story of Camp David, he said, was that for the first time in the history of the conflict, the American president put on the table a proposal very close to the Palestinian demands, and Arafat refused even to accept it as a basis for negotiations, walked out of the room and deliberately turned to terrorism. Does this sound like a leader that would recognize Israel's right to exist? He never did. Yasser Arafat, commenting on the 1993 Oslo Accord, which he signed only days prior, quote, "This agreement I am not considering any more than the agreement that was signed between our prophet Muhammad and the Quraysh, the Meccan tribe." And you remember that the Caliph Omar rejected his agreement, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and considered it a despicable truce. But Muhammad accepted it, and we are now accepting this peace accord, unquote. After the 67 Six-Day War, Arab nations met in Khartoum, Sudan, and the three no's phrase, no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with it, became a part of the Arabs' resistance to recognizing Israel. It is really rather simple. If the Palestinian and Arab nations laid down their arms tomorrow, recognized Israel, and swore off violence against Israel and Jews, there would be peace in the Middle East. If Israel was to do the same thing tomorrow, the second Holocaust would occur. From Israel's inception until today, the majority of Arab nations have refused to recognize the state of Israel, and as of yesterday's attack of over 300 rockets demonstrates, Arab leaders rejoice as Israel defends itself against senseless attacks. The children of Texas should know the truth as to why peace is so elusive.
Well, thank you, Mr. Kaufman. Describe again, in 40, the United Nations established Israel. That was an agreement. Who accepted that? Who rejected that?
The Israelis accepted it. The Arab nations rejected it.
And the day Israel declared its statehood,
May 14th,
what happened
1948.
what happened that night?
That night, war was declared on Israel by the 5 countries I mentioned, and the attacks occurred.
You're aware that Israel became a member of the UN General Assembly in 1949. You may not be aware of that. There were 57 states then, members.
Oh, I was aware of that.
Okay. Now there are 190 plus states.
93 in the General Assembly.
And most of the current Arab states were not independent until well after that, until after the 49.
That is correct. It was in
So
the 50s.
they came in later. When we had 57 states, 57 including Israel, members of the UN, voted to let the other states in there. But when they came in, there are 21 states right now of the UN who have never recognized Israel. Did you know that?
That is highly likely. I mean, a lot of African countries have never even been to Israel or heard of Israel.
Now, there are 15 now who do point to some of the conflicts that other people have mentioned, which is fair. We want a well-rounded teaching. Some of the mistakes have been made and things have been done, who have since then have separated, who will not now recognize Israel, but 21 have never recognized Israel. 15 more, including Venezuela and Cuba, have stopped negotiations with Israel, recognizing them as a state. And I stand by the comment that the thing here says how the refusal to recognize them, how that contributes to the conflict. It allows for other conversations too. They can say the 67 war, they can say the UN in 49, whatever, but the fact is still there, and facts are a tough thing. There are 36 countries, members of the United Nations, who will not recognize
It's hard to
Israel.
imagine. It's hard to imagine how states in the United Nations would not acknowledge another member state.
I cannot
In fact, the United Nations has voted to include Palestine, which is not even a state, so it's really abrogating the law of the institution. Nonetheless, they're given nation-state status as an observer, and it's politics. That's what that is.
Thank you, sir. A question for Mr. White then. This is your map here, right?
I copied it.
Okay, well, this is what I was talking about, and it just, I still argue the amendment allows for discussion why there's a rejection. That can still be discussed why there's
Absolutely.
a rejection. And again, 15 countries say they rejected it because of these things, but 21 have never recognized Israel. Did you know that the Arab League, just I think 12 years ago, said a true Arab-Israeli peace can only begin when we recognize the right of Israel to exist. Did you know that?
Yep.
That was even a statement made then to the Arab League, saying if we want real peace, it only begins once we recognize the right of Israel to even exist. Is that a true statement?
Yes, very much so. That once that starts, as I said, Israel is ready to discuss and has done that since we've highlighted it, since its very beginning. There have been multiple opportunities for the Arab nations to come forward and find a home for the Palestinians and to find a place, whether it was Jordan or Egypt or other places. There have been many, many opportunities, but those have all been rejected. And sadly, the Palestinian people have suffered as a result of it. They have been a pawn of the Arab League, the Arab nations now, to use them to try to divide and conquer Israel. And sadly, those people are sad. And there are many Palestinians who are living inside of Israel, and as Dr. Alfonsi would happy to testify, they're living there, gladly living there, because they have the rights to be able to do that. They don't have those rights in Gaza. They don't have those rights in in Jordan and other places, nearly like they do in Israel. So it's the only democratic form of government in that part of the world, and yet they've offered that opportunity, and it's been rejected numerous times since Israel's birth.
And again, how many missiles were fired yesterday?
Over 300 and many, many deaths. And there are already estimates, like you mentioned earlier, thousands of more rockets headed that way.
Hamas estimated on Saturday, they announced publicly 100,000 rockets ready to go. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Kaufman, I just, and obviously as we sit here, we've heard some different points of view. And so I mean, I'm hearing, certainly a different point of view. And so, when the Palestinians, or those who speak on their behalf, they speak about occupation, and they talk about confiscation of land and the denial of people to go back to their homeland and to their villages. How do you respond to that?
Well, before the 1967 war, the area of East Jerusalem and what is popularly called the West Bank was actually the part of Jordan. And at that time, the Palestinians were nowhere to be found in terms of laying claim to Jerusalem as its capital, and the West Bank is to be a state for Palestine. Where was the argument there? So no one was denying them there when Jordan had all the power to do so. So you're right. That's the facts have a way of getting mixed. Even today at the United Nations, even in UNESCO, you have the Palestinians who are trying to rename and recharacterize the Cave of the Machpelah, the Cave of the Patriarchs, where Abraham and other matriarchs and patriarchs are buried. And they say the Jews have no claim to this. Well, UNESCO is an education and cultural institution. It's not supposed to engage in politics. And that's why Israel and our friend the sheriff, Nikki Haley, and the United States have decided to withdraw from UNESCO because it's become a corrupt institution. And other United Nations agencies are close behind. In terms of other facts, I'd like to point out a couple of other things. Jews and Israelis did not kick out Palestinians after the 48 war. In fact, they were invited to stay. Today, 2 million Palestinians live in Israel. They work in Israel. They make 5 times what they could make doing whatever they would do for Palestinian businesses.
I'm Palestinian, and this is misinformation.
This is not
you
misinformation.
can ask me to speak on behalf of my people, rather than someone to say that we're allowed and what we're not allowed.
Yeah, that's fine. Although it is true, and we can point to organizations like SodaStream, which were removed from their operations. They were removed, costing Palestinians valuable jobs, even in management. That is a fact. It's a fact.
It was on stolen land.
It is, okay, so anyway, I'm not going to, I'll just stay focused with the question here, so I appreciate that. So, and one other point is a historical fact, is that in 1948, when Israel became a state, a legal entity state,
Jews were expelled from Arab countries, 850,000 of them. Fortunately, they could go to a place like Israel, but they were expelled. Jews didn't expel the Palestinians from Palestine. They did not expel them. They said, stay with us, grow a state with us.
Okay, I can respond. Okay, as a Palestinian, as I mentioned before, I have no right to return to my country. This is a fact. This is the denial of my human rights and my national rights. 8 million Palestinians are in the diaspora. This is the biggest refugee population in the world. And we are denied our rights to go back to our home. So how can that be justice? How can you claim that we are invited to stay?
Could I have the other, Mr. Kaufman? Sure. Or Colonel White, doesn't matter. I'll pose this question to both of you. Do both of you agree that there are two sides to the Arab-Israeli conflict, yes or no?
Sure, of course.
Okay. Sir?
Yeah, of course. There's three sides. The
Three.
Palestinian, the Arabs.
There you go. Three sides.
Russia, you mean,
Okay, maybe four. I mean, we're not even talking about Iran, that's not even an Arab state, am I correct? And several others. Okay, so my question, no, aside from the politics, let me just ask, don't we all agree that it's a multifaceted, complex issue? Let me ask that question of all of you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay. And if
That's all I want to know.
Okay, that's fine.
Sir.
I'd like to address the 8 million number and my friend here, and I sympathize with the Palestinian people. The issue is that is a number. There's no other refugee group in the history of the UN that has ever had the designation given to it that the Palestinian people have. If you're a refugee, it means you're the first generation of that group, and as those people die out, your ancestors are not, and the people, the people you birthed, those are not refugees. Only by the UN and by the Arab pressure within the UN did they increase this number. 8 million people will only increase over the years. There's not, how many Holocaust survivors are there? They are slowly dying out, and as the first generation of those Palestinians who were given the opportunity to live there chose to leave, those are the only true Palestinian refugees that should be recognized, and under any other definition, that's what it would be. So when you hear that number 8 million, keep in mind that is a special designation that has only been allowed to be applied to Palestinians. No other group in the history of the UN or the history of the world has that ever been applied for historical perspective.
Okay. No, I thought that Colonel White had been cut off, and I want to make sure he had finished his statement about, I know you're very involved in textbooks and et cetera. Was there a comment you wanted to make about that?
Okay, I'm sorry.
There's a review of textbooks, and for example, in the Palestinian and Arab countries, over 200 of those social studies textbooks were reviewed by experts and showed that there was a bias and a hatred expressing toward Israel and toward Jews. It was clear and it was blatant, and much of that money that we're paying for those came from the United States. It went through this same United Nations refugee group, and this is what's troubling, is that they're preaching this in the schools. And this is what we're all about here in textbooks, is to make sure that we're telling the truth. It's not a judgment against Muslims. I have many Muslim friends. I serve on many boards that serve and help Muslims. But it's about telling the truth. And we don't want to sugarcoat the truth, and we have to have the courage to speak the truth. So and I did mention the Treaty of Hudaybiyah for those who aren't familiar with what that is. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah was a phrase that Arafat used because he took great condemnation from the Arabs after he signed the Oslo agreements. He took that abuse because they felt like among many of the Arab leaders that they were in fact giving away the store. And he said to them 6 days later, it is the Treaty of Hudaybiyah that we have working under this. And that treaty was when Mecca and Muhammad in 628, he came to Mecca and announced to them he wants to go ahead and negotiate a treaty with them. And over the next 2 years, his forces grew from 1,500 to 10,000. And he went back to his troops and said, I've negotiated a treaty. And they said, what have you done? You're the most powerful. You're the most important. We're the most important. Why would you negotiate with them? And he said, I'm doing this because eventually it will work to our advantage. And sure enough, he found a reason to break the treaty, and in 2 years walked into Mecca and conquered it without firing a shot. So when he went back and said that to the people of the Arab world, they knew exactly what he was talking about. We're eventually going to take over that part of the world. You just have to trust me that Hudabayah, just like Muhammad, we will take over Israel, and that land will become ours. So that was a buzzword, code word.
Madam Chair, parliamentary inquiry. This is simply public testimony, 3 minutes to speakers, inappropriate for the board to try and debate the issue, nor receive a history lesson. I think Mr. Rowley kind of summed it up. So our job appropriately is to decide whether or not it's important enough to require to have this debate in our classrooms. So I just kind of implore the chair, can we move on? Without trying to resolve it, which we never will.
My problem is I'm very interested in history, and I enjoy these different perspectives on this, and so, yes, but I agree, we need to move on. Ms. Cargill, did you have an actual question? Oh, you did? Oh, sorry. Okay, Mr. Allen.
Badly stated what I wanted to ask.
Okay, great. Is there any other questions? Ms. Perez-Diaz.
I just had a quick question in terms of clarification. I think that the Colonel mentioned that refugee is generational, and I just wanted to correct that, because by definition, a refugee, generally speaking, is a displaced person who has been forced to cross national boundaries and who cannot return home safely. The gentleman to your right mentioned that he cannot return home safely. If he has children and his children cannot return home safely, they are refugees. I just wanted to make that very clear.
That is not the definition that's been applied.
I'm not asking, sir, I'm sorry, I just wanted to make that clarification.
Yeah, we need a question.
I look at the amendment and tell me what's wrong. It says, explain how the rejection of the state of Israel has led to conflict. It's a fact, but it allows discussion. And in the classroom, we keep saying 2 or 3 points of view. Well, before that, it watered down. But my question is, does that allow discussion? Does the current amendment allow discussion? Would both of you feel that it at least allows for discussion?
Sir, it's important to insert a broad context so we can have discussion. I mean, that's what the goal of intellectual pursuit is all about.
It leads to a very biased discussion that's based on an inaccuracy. You're supposed to explain something that's not true, so you end up believing it and accepting it as reality. That's how I see it.
Sure. My name is Sobia Siddiqui. I am the Communications Coordinator for CARE Houston. So the various independent school districts of Texas uphold a no-tolerance policy with bullying. The mental and emotional well-being of these students of our great state has always been an utmost concern and priority. Our teachers, our principals, our counselors are trained to keep a vigilant eye out to prevent bullying from even occurring and to take reasonable measures if it occurs regardless of their efforts. Consequences and punishments are communicated, students are followed up, parents are contacted, et cetera, et cetera. Yet all of these guidelines are standing in terms of bullying that occurs between people, between physical people. What is a student to do when the bullying is not a physical person, but a textbook, their source of knowledge? So, though there are a number of concerning removals and reinsertions that are up for debate right now, the one I want to bring to attention that has been brought to attention before is, number 1, the Arab rejection of the state of Israel, number 2, the reference to the Judeo-Christian legal tradition, and then number 3, the removal of the phrase that describes the optimism of the many immigrants who sought a better life in America. The reinsertion of the first 2 statements not only changes the narrative to favor one side of history over the other, but it also isolates the students whose lineage falls on that other side of history. Ask me that in person. It also enables the idea, I'm sorry, I lost track of where I was. Falls on the other side. So Arab rejection especially is an unconstitutional term as it clearly targets a particular people, and inaccurately so, as we have discussed. Referencing Judeo-Christian legal tradition also enables the idea that this is not a secular nation when the separation of church and state is clearly listed in our Constitution. Finally, after using these pragmatic terms of isolation, the further removal of the section of social issues affecting women and minorities eliminates not only the hope that is so crucially a part of the American spirit, but also the true foundation that this nation was built upon, ultimately skewing our history. The overall concern here returns to the bullying that our students, these changes are not something students can properly report. In fact, they may not even be able to communicate why it is that they are feeling the isolation in class. However, when this discussion occurs, they will not be able to turn away from the students that are staring at them, and they will not be able to veer away from the questions that so pointedly target them.
Question,
Go
if I
ahead and
could.
hit your, yeah.
Ms. Obia, in your testimony, you talk about the reassertion of certain things as the Arab rejection in the state of Israel, and talked about the Jewish Christian legal traditions. In those reinsertions, if they take place, is there anything that would be taught that you would see as an untruth? Just an untruth?
So the terminology using Arab rejection, I believe, would be an untruth, because it is not Arab rejection. As has been discussed throughout the day, there are a number of nations that have refused to work with Israel now, or they do not recognize Israel, or whatever that issue may be. But the terminology using Arab, it isolates a number of students. We're not talking about just Palestinian or Lebanese students. We're talking about any student that can trace their lineage and can consider themselves Arab. And the reason that I bring to attention these issues in terms of bullying in particular is because of my own experience. After 9/11, we were talking about the Iraqi war, but again, terminology was skewed, and so oftentimes what words were used were fundamentalists, Muslims, extremists, and terrorists, without quite identifying what all of that meant. And anytime any of those four words would come up, my entire class of 30 stared at me. And at the time, I didn't wear a hijab either, but it was because of the fact that I looked different. So to continue to use this terminology isolates our students. It doesn't allow for proper area to discuss what the actual issues may be, what is actually going on in Israel and Palestine. What it does is isolate these students, causing them to feel bullied, causing them to feel otherized in their community of peers.
The question is, when you are in the classroom teaching, does it prohibit the teacher from actually venturing into those areas for discussion? Or is there a factor where one may not want to go there because the public may see them as taking the students in a conversation that's not related to the curriculum? Because I believe the classroom should have a level of flexibility where a number of things are entered into, and the standard kind of guides that conversation.
I agree with that. I will say that there is a prohibition in a sense where students, again, it's all about the students right now for me and their mental well-being. By using these particular terms, it limits even what they are able to talk to their teachers with, because this is the textbook and the curriculum. So even if the teacher does not have a bias, them having to teach Arab rejection does not allow for the student to carry on a conversation or participate in class, because they may think that this teacher has a bias against me because I'm Arab, wherever that Arab nation may be.